Hi, this is Richard Gage, AIA architect, founder of Architects and Engineers for 911Truth. We're broadcasting from Montana today because we are on the last leg of our Pacific Northwest tour, which I'm very excited about telling you. We were in Great Falls and had a fantastic people in the audience, an assemblyman, a state assemblyman who, when he wins his reelection, and he's expected to this weekend, this summer, this June, he's going to put forth new legislation in Montana, state of Montana, to call for a new investigation. Very exciting. He's got some key players in the state who want the truth to get out about 9/11. How about that? That's pretty exciting. Well, Architects and Engineers for 9/11Truth has a new webinar series, and you're listening to it now, hopefully live. And I'm just delighted to have you aboard. And we have the archive version also of our broadcast, which you may also be listening to. And if you want to send that to everybody that you know, so that we can get the word out, I encourage you to do so. I'm joined by Andy, our operations coordinator, Andy Steele. Andy, say hi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Richard, for doing this here on the Sunday afternoon. I just want to remind everybody, as I always do, that we got some really nice slides in this presentation, but YouTube sometimes defaults to a low quality resolution. So if you want to see these in better resolution, just click the gear box below the video and hit 720 resolution HD. That should pop up and you'll be able to see this more clearly. And I want to encourage everybody to please submit your questions to us. We're going to be covering a very specific area of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence today. So we're going to be taking questions about the material covered this afternoon. If you have questions about other aspects of things that Richard talks about in the presentations, we invite you to come to later webinars where he'll be talking about those things more specifically. But please submit your questions to us. Back to you, Richard.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. Let's rock and roll then. We've got a lot to cover today. I'm very excited to bring you the evidence for the explosive evidence for the Twin Towers. In fact, we'll be looking into the witnesses of explosions and lots more. I want you to know a little bit about me, though. Who is this guy talking to you? I'm an architect. I've been an architect for 28 years. And 10 years ago, I was shocked to learn that there was a lot more to this story. The story of 9/11, specifically the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. We spoke last week about the 3rd skyscraper, World Trade Center 7, which drops uniformly, suddenly, symmetrically into its own footprint in the afternoon of 9/11 at about 5:20. And witnesses heard explosions, and we went through all of that evidence last week. You can take a look at that archive to catch up. It is extraordinary. Pass that one around too. We have, and I've worked on several different types of buildings. What you're seeing here is the $3 million and $10 million gymnasiums that I worked on the construction documents for. We also, the $125 million high school here near the in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the construction administration for this whole high school, but also I've worked more recently on mid-rise office space and large retail project and parking structure, about $400 million project with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing, some of which you see here. This project is complete now. And I'm joined in my effort to get a real investigation of the destruction of the towers by now more than 2,500 architects and engineers throughout the world, mostly in the U.S., calling for a new investigation, putting their reputations on the line because let's face it, this is not a popular activity. This has been something that most architects and engineers are still unaware of, and that's why we are raising the flag so that we can get more greater awareness and with all the different activities that you're going to be hearing about in the next hour. We have got to tell people what really happened to those towers on 9/11 and let people digest the implications of that. I mean, this is 15 years now almost that we've been wrestling with the public, the government, the media, trying to get people to cover this subject. And we have had some wonderful successes, which we can go over. Today, we're going to micro-focus right into the Twin Towers and its explosive destruction with its sudden near free-fall collapse and near symmetrical collapse, particularly in the case of the North Tower, with these high-velocity lateral ejections and the shattering of the steel frame from top to bottom, the mid-air pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete. All of this is what we're going to be looking at. Let's first consider the design of this building. Some thought it was the crowning achievement of the international style with its sculptural purity of forms, but others, like Robert Stern, FAIA, a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm a member as well. He says gigantic dumbness, right? You extrude two squares vertically until they become the highest buildings in the world. Not very creative in terms of its massing, especially compared to the Art Deco unfolding forms of the Empire State Building, which was, prior to the Twin Towers, the tallest building in the world. But however you feel about its design, what we have to acknowledge is the crowning achievement with the structural system, because before you had this forest of columns that you just saw. With the Twin Towers, they grouped those columns around the core and then forced to the outside the lateral resisting structural steel elements, this exoskeleton, this Verandil truss with these three perpendicular welded elements, columns and spandrel panels, and then in turn they were bolted, thousands and thousands of them all the way around. Inside you have these massive core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches, almost solid steel at the base. Up at the top, much thinner. And between the core and the perimeter are these trusses, lightweight steel trusses that you see here, spanning 60 feet. So what does that do? For the first time in skyscraper history, you have 60 feet of open office planning on each side of this core, and then 35 feet on the other side. This is an achievement. I mean, look at this. You have incredible areas uninhibited by columns, which allow you much more flexibility in office planning. However, the ceiling was very low in these buildings. The marching columns led some to feel like they were in a jail cell rather than the more modern, since the early 70s when these buildings were completed. There's more picturesque windows. So we had, by some accounts, only half occupied the tenancy in these buildings. So that was a huge problem for those considering the purchase of these buildings, which was done by Larry Silverstein and company just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, which is an interesting fact that we can talk about later. But the steel is 100,000 tons of heat sink. Any fires, which NIST claims was 1800 degrees, would be rapidly conducted throughout this massive interlocking steel system. And that's really the reason we have not had high-rises come down due to fires ever before or since 9/11. So and even when they're not fire protected, that is to say in mid-rise steel office buildings that were constructed simply to burn them down, they fireproofed some of them, and they do not come down even when they're not fire protected. But we'll come back to that. The official story was developed on the street that day. Let's listen.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell, right there, right from the street itself, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense. We'll come back to this and test it because we have the scientific method to test these types of myths and hypotheses. We take all of the hypotheses, the best guesses about what happened, because we have a question and we formulate it. How did these towers come down? We do some background research, make some observations. And with these hypotheses, which we don't rule out any rational hypotheses, we make predictions. We test those predictions with experiments. We analyze the results and we draw conclusions. And if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so others can build on the body of our work. This is very important. Openness, transparency, objectivity. That's the essence of science. We don't allow our personal or political agendas to warp the results. So we'll be evaluating how NIST did, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, relative to reporting openly, and in fact, how they used the scientific method, if it can be argued that they did at all. But if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back, construct a new hypothesis, one that stands a better chance against the evidence, the experiments, and so forth. So with this in mind, let's just take a brief overview of what are the reports that have been done, official investigations, which are really building reports. They're not investigations whatsoever, even as acknowledged by NIST and FEMA. In fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers, some volunteers came forth. Well, we're going to see who those volunteers are and what their role is or was. In 2002, FEMA took over these volunteers and brought them aboard. They got some funding, $600,000. We're going to see how that performance was done. There was another Silverstein-Weidlinger report, but this has not been made public. But finally, in 2005, we have NIST with 3 years and $20 million of funding, and they came out with their final report, and completely ejecting what FEMA had come up with respect to evidence of very, very hot temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. We'll come back to the NIST report, but with the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that some of these individuals who showed up as volunteers from the very beginning, brought into the FEMA report, brought into the Weidlinger report, brought into the NIST report, and many of them brought into the effort to discredit the questions raised by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and other members of the 9/11 Truth movement, to which they have they're completely off the mark. They go after red herring arguments that we don't even make, and they completely don't acknowledge that there's any architects and engineers who are organized and publicly demanding a new investigation. Well, what are we investigating? What NIST investigated was not evidence of explosives, for which they claim they found none, but later acknowledged they never looked. But they go after this evidence of destruction by fire, because essentially these are a fire theory. NIST even acknowledges that most of the jet fuel burns up outside the towers. The rest of it burns up in 10 minutes. That leaves normal office fires and some damaged columns. Well, the columns are very redundantly designed. The whole steel structure is. NIST praises the structural engineers for that work. But what they say is that the airplane impact knocked off the fireproofing, making these more vulnerable, lightweight steel trusses, vulnerable to the fires. And so what they say is that they sagged in response to the fires and pulled in these columns. Well, there was pulling in of columns visible on the structure before its collapse. However, the question about what was pulling in those columns really remains, because sagging floor trusses cannot pull in these columns. These are 14-inch square steel tube columns, and it would require a massive horizontal load to do just that. And so what does NIST do in their computer model? They apply an artificial 5,000-pound lateral load on every one of these columns, forcing them to fail in their computer so that they can justify somehow how this building came down. More likely, as we'll see, given the fact that the antenna in the case of the North Tower drops a half a second prior to the overall structure, indicating that indicates that the core columns failed. Well, if the core columns are failing underneath the antenna, they're going to then pull on the lightweight trusses, and those will indeed apply up to a 5,000-pound lateral load, which is a more realistic interpretation of the inward bowing columns. Well, what we're going to do, though, is not argue about what fire can or can't do to the steel structure, or how hot the fires were or weren't. And they weren't that hot, by the way. There's evidence with a thick black smoke that these fires were very low temperature. In the case of the World Trade Center 2, the South Tower, going out 10 minutes prior to its collapse. So we're going to be arguing instead today that there's evidence for the explosive demolition of these towers, particularly today with the explosive evidence. Next week, we'll be looking at the evidence of incendiaries, which is fascinating. And so we'll be looking for some of the typical features of explosive demolition and non-typical features in the case of the Twin Towers, because it's a very explosive event versus the very implosive event we found last week with respect to the World Trade Center 7 demolition. So we're looking for a sudden onset of destruction, not at the base of the structure, but at the point of jet plane impacts. Why? Well, this is a deceptive controlled demolition. We're being asked to focus on the jet plane, the explosions, the location of the initiation of failure up at that point. And so that's where we would be looking for evidence of explosions. And we'll be looking for witnesses that hear sounds of those explosions, that see flashes of light. Well, let's listen to the oral histories. The City Fire Commissioner, Thomas Von Essen, actually recorded in October 500 of his emergency medical technicians, firefighters, and they where this testimony was hidden. These oral recordings were kept hidden from the public by the city. And finally, the New York Times sued the city. The New York Court State of Appeals forced them to return it. And in August of 2005, we finally have the excerpts from the New York Times, interestingly enough, which show 118 of these firefighters observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena like this. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train under my feet. But then we looked up, and the tower's collapsing. Actually shook my bones, says this paramedic. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. Heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. In all of these accounts, you're hearing the firefighters give you a sequence of events, which is very important. The explosions happen, and then the debris flies. This isn't a collapsing building. That's collapsing, and then they hear these collapsing floors, which is what some of the so-called debunkers maintain. There was an explosion under the South Tower, one floor under another. I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up all these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Well, let's take a look at the North Tower on the right. Compare it to a known explosive demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? In fact, it looks exactly like in the first 4 seconds here. World Trade Center 7. It's sort of a phase one of this destruction is a miniature implosive controlled demolition. The top suddenly, uniformly, symmetrically drops at almost free fall acceleration, just like the known controlled demolition on the left. NIST never looked at the hypothesis of explosive demolition seriously. And yet it looks like, even though it looks exactly like one, even though fire, their official hypothesis and conclusion in their report, normal office fires with, in this case, the Twin Towers, jet plane impacts, jet fuel, that's never brought down a skyscraper, office fires. So all the hypotheses were not laid out. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Take a look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Again, since it looks exactly like one here in the first 4 or 5 seconds. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Let's listen to the reporters and the firefighters. Uh-oh.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there's secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to lay on all of us. It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden, you hear explosion, and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom.
And you heard the boom, 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 boom. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah.
Take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine NIST covered in their final report? 0, not 1, and there are hundreds. So what kind of use of the scientific method are they employing? Very important question. NIST says, well, couldn't have been controlled demolition because controlled demolitions start at the bottom. Well, let's listen.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Top down. So clearly,
you can go almost.
They're reaching for a hypothesis which they had pre-planned. In fact, their hypothesis actually says that this top section above the point of jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Well, let's look at the physics of this. I mean, Newton's third law of motion tells us there's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide, such as a Volkswagen and a Mack truck. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. A lighter object cannot destroy the heavier, intact, cold, hard steel below it. It might destroy the bumper of the Mack truck or parts of it below it and come to some sort of arrest. There'd be much resistance. 80,000 tons of structural steel is a heck of a lot of resistance for this lighter part The beams up there are only 3/8 of an inch average thick at the columns. So that, please, everybody turn off your cell phones. So let's take a look and see, because that's exactly what's happening in the North Tower in the videos, which directly contradicts NIST. In the first 4 seconds, this upper section destroys, is destroyed itself, just like Newton's law predicts. The question is, what's destroying it? Is it an actual collapse that starts naturally? Or is it, like the fireman described, a belt of explosions? Well, let's take a look here quickly. In the first 4 seconds, it's destroyed. You see a belt of thick smoke and hundreds of explosions, particularly in the lower right. You can see those explosions coming down. Let's take a closer look. We start and we stop. Bands of explosions, just like the fireman described. Start, stop, and start, and stop. Right, you can see the bands of explosions all the way around the building symmetrically. Fascinating. Well, in no video or photo do you see a block of building driving the rest of the building down. As you saw, it was destroyed. There's nothing left to destroy the rest of the building, and yet it is completely tearing itself apart in a geometry of fireworks, much like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, which you see on the right. So not a gravitational collapse. Gravity works down. Something else is going on here. Ask yourself, is this a collapse or an explosion? Look below. You see isolated explosive ejections violently expelled from the building. And in the lower right corner, traveling almost as fast as the freely falling debris, a rapidly advancing series of explosions, which is advancing faster than the explosions on the top. Take a look at those. In fact, we're going to zoom in on those explosions as we look at the South Tower. As it begins to fall over and falling off the building, 22 degrees, this section of South Tower, 30 stories high, is falling off the building. So we got asymmetrical loading from that massive pile driver, a massive section of building. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. We have asymmetrical damage from the fires. And yet watch what happens from below. Complete symmetry, like the fireman described, like a belt of explosions all the way around the building, all the way down to the ground, completely shattering the steel frame of this building all the way down to the bottom. Close up. What are we looking at here? A collapse or a series of hundreds and thousands of explosions, which on the audio appear then like a roar, because each one of which is less distinguishable by itself, though the fireman heard like a pop, like firecrackers. Yep, shattering all the way down to the ground, save these remaining shards, few shards of building. Well, what is the result of the ends of these core columns? They're splayed out. They're deeply reddened and oxidized, many of them, concave on one side, convex on the other. This deep red oxidation requires tremendous heat, indicating to some, like Gordon Ross in Scotland, an engineer who's calling for a new investigation as well, that they may have been splayed out, a concussive blast designed to break them and push them and break the welds from the side. Do we have a straight down symmetrical progression not inside the footprint like building 7, but in this case, outside the footprint of these buildings. Well, this is a 200-foot wide building, but the debris is extended outward 1,200 feet diameter, maybe 1,400 feet in many by some measurements, well beyond, in fact, the boundary of ground zero is an implosion. So, in fact, the Winter Garden, building 7 is the nice, neat pile on the right here, a classic implosion. But what we have throughout the World Trade Center is a very filling the entire complex full of debris and damaging, of course, irreparably all the other buildings beneath it. Do we have squibs, or these isolated explosive ejections occurring on the floors below? Well, take a look here, 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 20, 40, even 60 stories below the so-called pancaking collapse are explosions that are going off. Are they mistimed? NIST says, well, these are the results of, these are puffs of air being produced when that upper section went down, but we saw it was destroyed in the first 4 seconds. It's not available to push any air down, but let's say it was. You'd have air coming down the elevator hoistway, coming out somehow into the floors 20, 40 feet below, and in this open office that we saw earlier, it would equalize in pressure throughout that office and maybe blow all of those windows out, or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that occur often at the center of the facade in these buildings. Take a look at the South Tower. Immediately upon the explosions heard by the firefighters coming out of the left side, you see again and again here all of these isolated explosive ejections occurring all at once. This is not a puff of air being produced by this pile driver. That would be well down below, not uniformly across multiple floors at once, and these specific isolated ejections. Well, let's listen to David Chandler's analysis of these squibs.
As the South Tower begins to explode, we track 2 squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
These speeds are propelled by explosives, not air pressure. So we need a new investigation. We also see the total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up and loading, broken up for loading and shipment. I mean, the steel frame, there's no pile at the bottom. And everything's outside the perimeter, which you see in the white lines here, the North and the South Tower. Steel frame is completely broken up in 37.5-foot lengths in the case of the core columns, about 3 stories each. What's happening laterally, though? There's a complete lateral ejection of structural steel up to 600 feet. Well, watch. These are freely flying, isolated structural steel sections weighing at least 4 tons. And in this final case here, back 2, forward 2, 3. Back 2, 3, forward 2, 3. 45-degree ejection. What happens when you throw a ball out a window? It starts to go horizontal and then gravity takes over. Here we've got 45 degrees. This thing is landing 600 feet away. That is not a gravitational collapse. The lateral component of this can only be explained by high energy explosives, what we believe was also involved in these towers. And we'll look at some more evidence next week as well. But these are hurled 600 feet, completely destroying the winter gardens, which is a kind of a greenhouse affair here, completely destroying them. So there's enough energy in the hundreds of these units, up to 1,000, I believe, in both towers, to eject each one of them a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. That is an explosive force. But what about the floors? There were 110 floors in each of these twin towers. Each of them are an acre in size. That concrete, 90,000 tons of it, poured into these metal decking pans, which are missing also. What happened to it? There's not down at the floor, as you can see. We don't have 110 floors stacked up or broken up there. It's missing. In fact, these floor panels, there were 6,000 of them, says Tom Patrizio. He installed them, but he came back to help with the cleanup. He says, I couldn't believe it. Not one floor panel. You saw them bringing those floor panels in by a crane earlier. Well, there's only a 2-story pile, as you can see on the left. We're looking in a gravitational or pancaking collapse. We're looking for pancakes, as you see on the right in this Mexico disaster. So something else happened at the Twin Towers, leaving enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete, because concrete is missing. We're going to be taking a look at where it went. But this is where it started. It's being pulverized in midair, not when its gravitational potential develops down at the bottom and crashes and turns to powder down there. No, something very explosively is happening in midair, as you can see. Reducing it to 100 micron particles average. This is a powder. So concrete, reinforced concrete, is being turned to a powder. What kind of explosive force can do this? And laying like a blanket across lower Manhattan, 4 inches thick, a 3 square mile area. Yeah, the U.S. Geological Survey in its toxicological studies identifies up to 30% of that powder is concrete. Well, that's where the concrete is. How did it get there? Let's listen to Governor Pataki.
There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were file cabinets, probably about 10,000 of them, but this is the only one that they could find. It was in the basement in an ice cream store. What happened to 10,000 file cabinets? What happened to all those desks and chairs? What happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments, a ½ an inch long, the biggest one, found on top of the skyscraper across here, across the street from the South Tower. Well, those people didn't come from this plane because it sent its ejections out the other side of the South Tower. They didn't come from the people in this plane heading into the North Tower because the South Tower completely blocks the Deutsche Bank building from the North Tower. So what happened to those people. Same thing that happened to the concrete. Well, we have 2,749 victims in the World Trade Center towers, but only 300 whole bodies were found. We'd expect to find a whole lot more whole bodies. They found 20,000 pieces of bodies. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces of them matched to a single person. So one person is blown into 200 pieces. And still, 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for, vaporized. Let's look at where these body parts ended up. Well beyond the boundaries of ground zero, all over the place. It's kind of macabre, but it makes a point that demands an answer. This question is just obscured, like all of these other questions, by the mainstream media. Do you think gravitational collapse could cause such massive body pulverization and distribution over a 2,000-foot diameter? Do you think the hypothesis of explosive demolition is corroborated? And this is just week 1. We're going to week 2 next week with extreme heat evidence. We believe that so far we've shown many of the features of controlled demolition, atypical and typical. That direct evidence of explosive destruction is what we're looking at. That fires can't account for any one of these, let alone all of them. That's the official cause for this building's collapse, along with jet plane impacts and fuel. That with additional corroborating evidence, circumstantial evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. And now you know why there's 2,500 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation, and they're taking action. Collectively, we're all taking action, and we want you to be a part of it. So sign the petition calling for a new investigation. Stand up and be counted. Become a member of AE911Truth. We don't exist by the grace of major donations from major corporations. In fact, we haven't had one. So we exist because many, many, many people take it upon themselves to take responsibility for the freedom of information that is not flowing in the mainstream media, and they become a member. You can donate also. A large donation can be very helpful. We have large projects that require lots of funding, such as the $5,000 booth at the American Institute of Architects Convention, May 19, 2021, where we will go with our AIA members and support our resolution on the floor with a 10-minute debate on World Trade Center 7. Historic debate. We need your support in getting us that booth and giving us that opportunity to bring those experts, to bring that information to the top 400 AIA professionals in the country. Unprecedented opportunity. And volunteer. We do need you to do things right from your own computer. Andy, what kinds of projects do we have for people to get engaged in?
Well, there's lots of things going on, as always. We're constantly sending out the Beyond Misinformation booklet to various professionals in architectural, engineering, other sciences, sending it out to people in law enforcement. Soon will be many projects that anybody here can help out with, even if it's simple tabling. So if you want to volunteer and help out, just go up to the What You Can Do tab at the top of this webpage, AE911Truth.org. You hover over that, you'll see a tab to volunteer. Simply fill out the form, and we will be in touch with you and get you started.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. That's helpful. And also from your own computer, you can contact your elected representatives. When they get repeated calls, they do something. When enough people call, television, radio, newspaper, tell everyone you know. Send the AE911Truth.org link to every architect you can find, in fact, every engineer, everybody else that you know. Screen the DVDs to audiences. Share our resources from our store, AE911Truth.org. This is the website, of course, and you'll see what can you do up there. Well, that's where our store is found. And our 52-page booklet is an extraordinary way to help other professionals, particularly. And it's not overly technical, but you can, thousands of people have received this. In fact, we've sent it to 20,000 engineering and architecture academic professionals, and probably about 50,000 people have received this already, and it's got rave reviews. It's a very important piece of the latest piece of our formatting of our evidence. And one of the coolest efforts we've made is the landmark DVD 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. It is really well done, enough that it is received, well, it's been seen well over 1 million times. Let me give you a sneak preview, in fact.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
if this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And indeed, you can screen this film in your living room. The 1-hour version of it is on YouTube. It's free. Just search in YouTube for Experts Speak Out. The 1.5-hour film is in our store. And as I mentioned earlier, we have completed now our 13-city Northwest tour, screening the most recent film we made, Firefighters, Architects, and Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. And this is a historic opportunity that we had with Eric Lawyer, founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity, who has 200 firefighters calling for a new investigation. And he and I filmed this a few years ago, and finally it's been edited, and we have now been through the Southwest, the Northeast, and the Northwest, and in early June we'll be in the Southeast states, and early July, the Midwest, and in Canada in the first 2 weeks of August. So feel free to join us there and let us know if there's a city that we've got to come from, because we need boots on the ground in order to make these effective outreach opportunities. So with that in mind, we've looked today at the explosive destruction, week 3. Week 4, again, we'll be coming to the extreme hot temperatures, but I think we have a few questions from our listening audience, don't we, Andy?
We sure do. The first one asks, or first it states, and then it asks, NIST placed a steel beam across an open pit with weight on the beam and jet fuel in the pit to demonstrate how the beam will sag. Is it possible to repeat this experiment with vertical box columns to see if the sagging beam will pull in the box columns as the NIST report claims?
It's certainly possible to test NIST's theory. Absolutely. You could take a horizontal lightweight steel truss and test it. In fact, the Underwriter Laboratory did exactly that at NIST's request after 9/11, and it didn't fail whatsoever. So this is what cost Kevin Ryan his job at Underwriter Laboratory, who tested this steel, and he made quite a stink about it, as all employees there should have, and people around the world. And their response was not to answer some very good questions, but to fire him. So regarding that, National Geographic did a show, a special, and they interviewed myself and David Ray Griffin and others, and their effort was to do 3 really ridiculous experiments, one of which was the one that the listener highlighted, in which they had a pool of jet fuel burning underneath a very light beam with a very heavy load right in the middle of it, and said, look, this beam failed, after they lit it on fire. And it shows nothing. I mean, it's a ludicrous experiment from beginning to end. Even, by the way, the jet fuel manufacturer cites that their jet fuel burns only 600 degrees in open air, and yet they said that this burning jet fuel in this experiment got up to 2,000 degrees, which it can't even do. So there's a lot of reasons to distrust these experiments and those who funded them.
Okay, our next question asks, and this is a perfect follow-up, is there any evidence available for testing stored away somewhere?
Is there any evidence available for what?
For testing stored away somewhere.
Of evidence of testing that is stored away somewhere? I don't understand the question.
Evidence available for testing.
Oh, I see. Yeah, like sure. We've got hundreds of thousands of tons of of concrete powder from the World Trade Center that's been scooped off the streets of Lower Manhattan, taken to Fresh Kills landfill, and buried under 6 feet of concrete. So we'd certainly like to have that unearthed and tested, but we do have much of that available for testing. In fact, it's been sent to several people. The international team of scientists that we're going to be looking at in next week's webinar series, which is week 4, looks at the testing that's been done by this international team of scientists. So be sure to come back and look at that. There's steel in many sculptures all around the United States. And much of this has been tested, in fact, by Stephen Jones, who's a nuclear scientist who has been given several different samples from these different steel monuments and found evidence of thermite on them. There's no shortage of evidence, but I can tell you this: the videos are the best evidence of all. They show exactly what happened, and it's right in front of God and everybody, and you can see the free fall acceleration of these buildings. Building 7 near free fall in the case of the Twin Towers, completely violating NIST's own theory that of the pile driver, as we saw, that wasn't even available to drive the rest of the building down.
Okay, the next question asks, how long would you estimate it would take to wire the buildings for demolition?
Well, we understand from the demolition industry that it takes months to engineer and place these explosives. And in this case, we're talking about incendiaries as well as explosives, high energy explosives. So it's a very, very complex job. These are 3 of the world's largest controlled demolitions, which is one of the reasons it's kind of inconceivable to imagine that this could have been even done. It's a huge lie. It's a lot to overcome our own inertia in our thinking, to imagine the possibilities, you know, how they could do it in the first place. It would take months to answer the question directly. Clearly, months. Interestingly enough, they had a elevator modernization going on the 9 months prior to 9/11, which could have given access to undercover operatives. And in fact, there were 85 employees of ACE Elevator in the towers when the planes hit, and they fled. This was quite a scandal, documented by USA Today. And they're supposed to stay and help the firefighters, but they all fled. These are experts in the delivery systems, the elevator cabs, of the rescue of these victims. So we certainly want an investigation of ACE Elevator and the security company, Securicom, Stratosec, who had this security contract, under whose noses we would have had tons and tons and tons of all kinds of very interesting materials coming through.
Okay, our next question is one we get a lot. We'll visit it again because it's been asked, but it's asked, aren't most controlled demolitions done from the bottom up?
Yeah, most of them are. I think you get better, well, it's riskier if something doesn't go right. If you don't blow all those columns at the bottom, that building stands a very good chance of tipping over, which in the case of Lower Manhattan could do an awful lot of damage with a 1,400-foot high building. Again, two of the tallest buildings in the world in the early 70s. So maybe, I mean, in the case of a top-down controlled demolition, which we saw examples of in this very webinar today, they can certainly do it. And it would give them less risk of the building tipping over. You just take out one floor at a time. Yeah, so I think they did it almost at free fall, which kind of gave it away. I mean, imagine if you could have set those devices off in a slower rhythm or sequence, timing sequence, you might have been able to actually get people to imagine with the hesitation there that there was time for column buckling as columns resisted that load upon them. But that wasn't done, and that makes it a whole lot easier to spot foul play here with controlled demolition.
Okay. Next question asks, how does NIST explain why the top part of the towers fell through the path of greatest resistance instead of just tipping over and falling onto the plaza?
Well, they have a magical theory that the columns gave way at the point of jet plane impacts, allowing this 15-story section in the case of the North Tower, 30 stories in the case of the South Tower, to drive the rest of the building down. And the magic in that is, I mean, we might be able to buy that if we saw anything driving anything down, but we don't see, because each of those masses have been destroyed in the first 4 seconds. It completely pulls the rug out from under their theory, but nevertheless, that is their theory, and it came out 2 days after 9/11 in a paper provided by Zdeněk Bezant. It's just hard to imagine somebody focused enough in 2 days to have a multi-page, highly complex series of calculations to explain or try to explain what happened. It's ludicrous. That would have taken weeks and months to develop that kind of analysis. I mean, let's face it, people are in shock for the first few days. They can't do anything. But anyway, this is what we've been contending, and others like Tony Zambotti have submitted their responses refuting Bezant, and in some cases, there's been success in submitting these papers to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, for instance. And you can see these papers also at journalofnine11studies.com.
Okay, our last question today asks, has there been any follow-up with the firefighters who reported explosions on 9/11 other than from the original oral histories?
Well, certainly there's one notable example that everybody should meet. Rudy Dent, FDNY, retired now. He was on the pile working with the other firefighters. He, in fact, saw Building 7 go down. He's been interviewed several times. He's on YouTube. I encourage everybody to go to YouTube and search Rudy Dent, D-E-N-T. His video, his interview with InfoWars, Leanne McAdoo, has been seen over 1,600,000 times. So that's one notable example. Eric Lawyer, of course, who's featured in our latest film, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. You can see him in the hour-long version of that film, free on YouTube as well.
Okay, well, that is all for today. So I want to thank everybody for coming to this afternoon's webinar. And we're going to be back at it on Thursday at 1 o'clock Pacific time. That translates out to 4 o'clock Eastern time. So please, if you are moved by this evidence, you think other people should see it, forward the link to our webinar page to them and tell them to tune in.
Yes, in fact, we'll be looking at the Twin Towers again, a short overview, but then we'll be focusing on the pyroclastic-like clouds that emanate out of their extremely hot clouds from molten iron and steel, found by first responders, structural engineers. We'll be looking at all of those witnesses and video and photos of that material. Iron microspheres, the evidence of molten elemental iron, evidence of thermite and nanothermite. It's a fascinating part of the final part of our webinar series. So yeah, definitely come back Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, and we'll see you all there. Thanks so much. Good night.